On Christmas Eve, my sister stood up and said, "Since Dad's gone, I'm taking over the estate." My mom nodded. It's only right. She was always the responsible one. My brother clinked his glass. To the new head of the family. I just sipped my drink, opened my laptop, and said, "That's weird, because according to this, I own everything starting January 1st. And then I turned the screen around. I, 32M, sat at the long oak dining table that Christmas Eve, nursing my whiskey while the fire crackled in the background and snow fell softly outside the windows of our family estate. The house felt different without Dad, heavier somehow, like the walls themselves were grieving. It had been 3 months since the funeral, and this was our first holiday gathering without him. Mom had insisted we all come together, said it was what he would have wanted. My sister stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She'd always had a flair for the dramatic, and tonight was no exception. She announced that since Dad was gone, she would be taking over the estate. Her voice carried that same authoritative tone she'd perfected during her years as a corporate lawyer, the one that made people instinctively defer to her judgment. Mom nodded almost immediately, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She said it was only right, that my sister had always been the responsible one. The statement hung in the air like an indictment. I felt my jaw tighten, but said nothing. My brother raised his glass with a grin, the ice clinking against the crystal. He toasted to the new head of the family, his words slightly slurred from the expensive wine he'd been downing since he arrived. He'd always been a follower, happy to coast along on whatever arrangement benefited him most without having to lift a finger. I took another slow sip of my drink, feeling the burn slide down my throat. Then I opened my laptop, the blue glow illuminating my face in the dim candlelight. I mentioned that something seemed weird, and that according to what I was looking at, I would actually own everything starting January 1st. Then I turned the screen around so they could all see. The room went completely silent. Even the fire seemed to stop crackling for a moment. My sister's face went from confident to confused to pale in the span of about 3 seconds. She asked what I was talking about, her voice climbing an octave. Mom leaned forward, squinting at the screen, asking what that document was. My brother just sat there with his mouth slightly open, looking between me and the laptop like he was watching a tennis match. I explained calmly that it was Dad's actual will, the one he'd had drafted 6 months before he died. The real one, not whatever version they'd apparently convinced themselves existed. I watched their faces as I walked them through it page by page. The estate, the investment accounts, the business holdings, the vacation properties, all of it was coming to me. There were provisions for Mom, of course. A generous monthly allowance, the right to live in the main house for as long as she wanted, full medical coverage. But control? That was mine. My sister finally found her voice and demanded to know why she wasn't mentioned. She rattled off her accomplishments, her law degree, her success in business, how she'd always been the one Dad relied on for important decisions. Her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. I let her finish before I responded. I told her that maybe Dad had noticed some things she thought he hadn't, like how she'd tried to convince him to move into a nursing home 2 years ago when he had that minor stroke, even though his doctors said he was fine. She'd been looking at properties, touring facilities, all behind his back. I'd been the one who found out and told him. Or how she'd encouraged him to sell the family business that his grandfather had started because the real estate was worth more than the company itself. She'd already had developers lined up, ready to turn it into luxury condos. Her face flushed red and she started to protest, but I kept going. I reminded everyone how she'd missed his birthday last year because of a work trip to Cabo that she'd posted all over social media. Or how when he'd asked her to help him update his computer systems at the office, she'd sent an assistant instead of coming herself. Mom interjected, her voice trembling, saying that I was being cruel. She insisted my sister had always cared about Dad, that I was twisting things. She turned to my sister for support, but my sister was staring at the table, her lawyer composure finally cracking. I looked at my brother next. He'd been unusually quiet, probably calculating how this affected his own situation. I asked him if he wanted to know why he wasn't mentioned either, beyond a small trust fund. He'd already burned through the money Dad had given him for his startup 3 years ago. Then there was the time he'd borrowed $50,000 for investment opportunities that turned out to be a gambling debt in Vegas. Dad had paid it off quietly to avoid embarrassment, but he'd kept the receipts. I had them all. My brother's face went white. He muttered something about family loyalty and how I was acting like I was better than everyone else. His hands clenched into fists on the table. I told him I wasn't acting like anything. I was simply the one who'd been here. For the past 5 years, I'd been the one who had Sunday dinner with Dad every week. I'd been the one who drove him to his doctor's appointments when Mom was busy with her book club or charity events. I'd been the one who sat with him in the hospital during his treatments, who learned how to manage his medications, who listened to him talk about his fears and regrets at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. I'd been the one who worked at the family business not because it was prestigious or lucrative, but because he'd built it and it meant something to him. I'd learned every aspect of it from the ground up, just like he had. I knew every employee's name, every client's history, every system and process. My sister had a law degree from an Ivy League school, and my brother had an MBA, but I was the one who actually understood what Dad had spent his life building. The truth was, they'd all been waiting for him to die. Maybe not consciously, maybe they'd even convinced themselves they loved him, but their actions told a different story. They'd been circling like vultures, already dividing up assets in their minds, already planning what they'd do with their inheritance. My sister had even mentioned to Mom once that the main house would sell for millions in the current market, that they could all make a fortune if they liquidated everything. She hadn't known I was in the next room. Mom was crying now, asking how I could say such horrible things. She insisted they all loved Dad, that I was being unfair and hateful. But I could see in her eyes that she knew I was right. She'd gone along with all of it because it was easier than confronting the truth. I pulled up another document on my laptop, an email from my sister to a real estate developer dated just 2 weeks after Dad's diagnosis. She'd been inquiring about property valuations, asking for preliminary assessments. She'd used a personal email account, probably thinking no one would ever see it. But Dad had been more tech-savvy than she realized. He'd had monitoring software on the family network, and I'd inherited access to those accounts along with everything else. My sister's face went from red to ashen. She tried to explain, saying she'd just been planning for the future, being practical. She claimed she'd wanted to know what options were available in case they needed to make difficult decisions. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears, I could tell. I closed my laptop and stood up. I told them that the estate transfer would happen automatically on January 1st, as Dad had specified. Until then, everything remained in the trust. I let them know they were welcome to contest the will if they wanted, though I should mention that Dad had anticipated that possibility. He'd left detailed written and video statements explaining his reasoning, recorded with his lawyer present. Perfectly admissible in court. I also informed them that the family business was going to continue operating exactly as Dad had intended. The employees would keep their jobs and their benefits. The charitable foundation Dad had established would continue its work. The scholarship fund he'd set up for employees' children would remain funded. None of it would be liquidated or sold off for a quick profit. My brother asked angrily what he was supposed to do now. He'd been counting on that inheritance, had already made plans. He had debts, he said. He needed money. I told him he could get a job, a radical concept I understood might be foreign to him. The trust fund Dad had left him would provide a modest income if he managed it properly, which I doubted he would. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My sister finally exploded. She screamed that I'd manipulated Dad, that I'd turned him against his own family. She accused me of being conniving and deceitful, of playing the devoted son, while actually just securing my inheritance. She said she'd fight this, that she'd tear the will apart in court and expose me for what I really was. I waited until she was done, then asked her one simple question. If she cared so much about Dad and family, why had she spent the last decade treating him like an inconvenient obligation? Why had every interaction been transactional, every visit scheduled around what benefited her? She had no answer for that. None of them did. I picked up my laptop and my coat. I told Mom that her monthly allowance would start on January 2nd and that her position in the house was secure as long as she lived. That hadn't changed. I wasn't cruel like they'd apparently decided I was. I informed my siblings that they could reach out to Dad's lawyer if they had questions about the will's provisions. His contact information was in the documents I'd emailed to everyone before dinner, which none of them had apparently bothered to read. As I walked toward the door, Mom called after me, asking where I was going. It was Christmas Eve, she said. We were supposed to be together as a family. I turned back and looked at the 3 of them sitting there, their their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. I told them that we hadn't been a family in a long time. We'd been people who shared a last name and a genetic connection, who gathered for holidays and obligations, who smiled for photos and pretended everything was fine. But a real family showed up. A real family cared. A real family didn't measure love in terms of inheritance potential. Dad had known that. That's why he'd made the choices he did. Update 1. The legal battle started 3 days after Christmas. My sister hired a high-powered firm out of Chicago, probably spending more on legal fees than she'd ever get back even if she won. They filed a petition contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence. They claimed I'd manipulated Dad during his illness, that he hadn't been in his right mind when he'd made his final arrangements. Dad's lawyer had been expecting this. We released the video statements, all 12 hours of them, recorded over a 6-month period. In them, Dad was articulate, clear-minded, and devastatingly honest about his reasons. He talked about each of his children, his voice steady and sad. He explained that he'd watched us all grow up and that he'd seen who we'd become. He said he loved us all, but that love didn't mean being blind to reality. The most damaging part for my sister was when Dad recounted, in detail, the conversation where she'd suggested the nursing home. He described how betrayed he'd felt, how he'd realized in that moment that she saw him as a burden rather than her father. He spoke about my brother's gambling and financial irresponsibility, about Mom's willingness to go along with whatever made her life easier. Then he talked about me. His voice got softer, almost emotional. He mentioned the Sunday dinners, the quiet conversations, the way I'd learned the business not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand what mattered to him. He said I was the only one who'd ever asked him about his grandfather, about the early days of the company, about what it meant to build something that lasted beyond yourself. The petition was withdrawn 2 weeks later. My sister called it a strategic decision, but really, there was no case. Dad had been thorough, and his lawyer had documented everything perfectly. Update 2. I took control of the estate on January 1st as scheduled. The transition was seamless because I'd been essentially managing everything anyway for the past 2 years. The business continued operating without interruption. I met with every employee personally, assured them their jobs were secure, and announced a profit-sharing plan Dad and I had been developing before he died. Mom stayed in the main house, though things between us were strained. She'd call occasionally, usually when she needed something, but we didn't have the kind of conversations we'd had before. She'd made her choice that Christmas Eve, and we both knew it. She'd chosen the version of reality that was comfortable over the truth that was difficult. My brother disappeared for a while. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to Nevada, was working in marketing for a casino company. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd sent one email after the will contest failed, 3 sentences long, accusing me of destroying the family. I didn't respond. My sister and I didn't speak for 8 months. Then one day I got a call from an unknown number. It was her. She sounded different, tired maybe. She asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a neutral location downtown, a quiet cafe where no one knew either of us. She looked older somehow, like the past year had aged her more than it should have. She started by saying she wasn't there to apologize, which was very on-brand for her. But she wanted to understand. She asked me when I'd known, when I'd realized that Dad was going to leave everything to me. I told her the truth. About 8 months before he died, we'd been sitting in his study late one night, going over quarterly reports. He'd closed the laptop and just looked at me for a long moment. Then he'd asked me a question. Did I do this because I loved him or because I wanted the inheritance? I'd been insulted at first, I told my sister. But then I'd really thought about it, and I'd realized that I didn't care about the inheritance. I cared about him. If he'd left everything to charity, I would have been fine with that. I'd have been sad, maybe, but I'd have understood. What I couldn't have accepted was watching everything he'd built get torn apart and sold off by people who saw dollar signs instead of legacy. My sister was quiet for a long time after that. Then she asked what her share would have been if Dad had split everything equally. I told her the number. She nodded slowly, doing mental math. She mentioned that she'd spent nearly that much on her legal fees, on lifestyle maintenance during the contest, on proving a point that couldn't be proven. I asked her if it had been worth it. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she told me something I hadn't known. When she was 12 years old, Dad had missed her school play because of a business emergency. She'd been the lead, had practiced for months. Mom had been there, but Dad's empty seat in the front row had been all she could see. She'd decided that night that success meant being so important that people couldn't ignore you, so valuable that they had no choice but to put you first. She'd spent 20 years building that version of success, she said. And then Dad had died and left everything to the person who'd simply chosen to show up. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said nothing. She just wanted me to know that she finally understood. Maybe too late, but she got it now. What Dad had been trying to teach all of us. That value wasn't measured in achievements or status. It was measured in presence, in showing up, in caring when it was inconvenient. We finished our coffee in silence. As she stood to leave, she said one more thing. She told me Dad would have been proud of how I'd handled everything. Then she walked out, and I sat there alone with my empty cup, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not quite forgiveness, but maybe the possibility of it, somewhere down the line. The estate runs smoothly now. I work from Dad's old office, sitting at his desk, sometimes picking up the fountain pen he always used and just holding it. The business is thriving, actually growing for the first time in years because we're focused on long-term stability rather than short-term profits. The employees respect me, not because I own the company, but because I know their names, their families, their concerns. Mom had dinner with me last Sunday. It was awkward at first, both of us dancing around everything that had happened. But then she asked about Dad's favorite recipe, a pot roast he used to make. She wanted to try making it herself. We spent the evening cooking together, and for those few hours, it felt almost normal. I learned that inheritance isn't really about money or property. It's about what gets passed down that you can't put a price tag on. The values, the lessons, the understanding of what truly matters. Dad left me everything. But the real inheritance was in all those Sunday dinners, all those quiet conversations, all those moments when I chose to be present instead of somewhere else. My siblings might never fully understand that, and that's okay. They have to live with their choices just like I have to live with mine. The difference is, I can sleep at night knowing I did right by the person who mattered most. That Christmas Eve, they thought I was being cruel when I turned that screen around. But I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was showing them the truth they'd been avoiding. Sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is let people live comfortably in their illusions. Dad understood that. That's why he made the choices he did, and why I'll keep honoring them, no matter what anyone thinks. The snow is falling outside my window right now, just like it was that night. But this time, I'm sitting in Dad's chair, running his company, protecting his legacy. And somehow, I think he knew all along that this was where I'd end up. Not because I manipulated him or schemed or played politics, but because when everyone else was planning their futures, I was just being his son. That was enough for him. And it's enough for me too.